Good afternoon and good morning to those of you out west, and welcome to today's Center for Migration Studies webinar entitled New Undocumented Report, Fact-Based Demography and Just Policies in Challenging Times. My name is Mario Russell. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies. For over 12 years, CMS has been producing estimates and demographic analyses of the undocumented and authorized population in the United States. Our focus under the intellectual leadership of our chief demographer, whose most recent report is our starting point for today's presentation, has been to render a fact-based, true and accurate accounting and picture, that is to say, the size and the characteristics of the foreign-born who are living in the United States without documented status or with liminal authorized permission. In the last years, and particularly today, we believe this work is more important than ever. For this reason, I'm thrilled first to announce that the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs has joined CMS in a new partnership to study this population in the years to come. Teamed with its researchers and scholars, and today we're joined by Ryan Allen, we will broaden and deepen our study of the undocumented and unauthorized population and make this data accessible even more to researchers, advocates, the media, and the general public. So please visit our new web-based data tool, which is open public for use by all. And so we're also delighted to introduce and share with you today the latest data on the undocumented and authorized, data that tells us so much that is true and accurate about the single most, I think, important social issue of the moment: the mass deportation of immigrants, the breaking up and the separation of families, the evisceration of the workforce. Facts matter. Truth is not relative. Neither should serve as a tool for political perception, but rather be the source of information for just social goals. That is, the building of the common good. In a moment of crisis and pain as we find ourselves in now, this calls for greater courage and greater imagination. It calls us to act from our best self, whether as individuals or as a community. Misinformation is the coin of the realm. We hear 20 million undocumented migrants, maybe 30 million, most depicted as criminals, perhaps occupying, if not suffocating, the labor force and draining the economy, threatening culture, identity, and more. Now, we are beginning to see the beginnings of responses, whether in the form of lawsuits, statements, demonstrations, and more. This process is and may be uneven, but it is a beginning. But to that end, I therefore encourage you to come to the immigrant integration convening that we are co-hosting with Fordham University in September here in Manhattan, in New York. And so while there's a deeper question about the why and the where from of the resentment that is at the heart of the policies of the moment, and more importantly, how and where from we begin a process of healing, our task today is quite specific, which is to communicate what are the truths about this population and what are some of the policies that are implicated, many of which have come to be distorted by the distortion of facts. So for this, we'll hear from three experts who are joining us today. Bob Warren, Senior Visiting Fellow at CMS, who leads research on the undocumented. Bob served as a demographer for 34 years with the US Census Bureau and the former Immigration and Naturalization Service. As I noted, he wrote the report on the 2023 estimates and will speak about the current size and characteristics of that population. Then we'll hear from Philip Connor, who will talk about the trends and characteristics of the temporarily protected immigration population in the US, a group of quasi-legal statuses that have become sizable and significant piece of the broader undocumented population. And here we use interchangeably sometimes the term authorized to describe this group as well, or temporarily authorized. Philip is a senior demographer and director of the Immigration Fellows Program at Forward.us, as well as a research fellow at the Center for Migration and Development at Princeton University. And in December 2024, published an article in the International Migration Review entitled Protected Yet Undocumented. Then finally, we'll hear from Ryan Allen, who will comment on recent changes to policies and on the geopolitical context that helped to explain the trends in the undocumented immigrant population. Of note, of course, is how a sizable part of this population has come to rely over time on assurances of protection and support from the United States over the past decade or more. Ryan is a professor at the University of Minnesota with a dual appointment at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and the University of Minnesota Extension. He also serves as Associate Dean for Research at the Humphrey School. So we'll hear from each panelist in sequence, and at the end of the presentation, which will each last about 10 to 12 minutes, we will take questions for them from the audience. And I invite you to put those questions at any point in the Q&A function, not the chat function. Please feel free to put questions, as I said, as the panelists speak, but just a reminder that we will hold those questions until all three of them are done. So with thanks to you for attending and with thanks to the panelists, I turn it now to you, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. I'd like to thank the folks at CMS for organizing this and for all the audience for showing up. My plan today is to just describe our data sources, how we make the estimates, look at some trends, and then I have a couple of graphs that I think are interesting that are actually shown in the report, but I'll be talking about those. So first, the first slide, you can go to the next slide, please. First slide shows basically where we get the data and what we do with it. The American Community Survey is a huge survey of about 3.5 million households, plus a sample of group quarters. It turns out in 2023, especially the group quarters enumeration is important. Group quarters include college dorms and nursing homes and military barracks, but it also includes shelters and places where migrants stay temporarily. It's very likely that that last part of the group quarters population was undercounted in 2023, but I'll get to that a little later. So CMS uses data from 3 questions in the survey: country of birth, citizenship, and year of arrival. And what we do is we go into the data and we select the non-citizens that arrived after 1981. The entire undocumented population is in that data. If you arrived before 1981, you were legalized under the IRCA legalization program. And so we select that data, and then we go into the data and we remove all of the legal residents that we can identify. First, we identify, for example, people who are receiving Medicare or foreign students that have only been here 2 or 3 years, people who arrived as refugees, government workers, all the people that we can identify as being legal, and we remove those from our data set. And then we have one more adjustment that involves ratios, but I think I think for that kind of detail, I'll just refer you to the references in our report. So that's essentially how we do the estimates. We just take the data from the ACS, we remove the legal residents, and we make an adjustment for undercount. And the next slide shows the actual numbers for 2023. We see that 21.5 million non-citizens arrived after 1981, and we identified 10.6 million that we believe to be legal residents. About 8 million of those we identified through by looking at the characteristics of the population in the survey, and then the other 2 million were those ratios I mentioned. Anyway, we came up with 10.6 million that we believe were legal residents. That leaves 10.9 million counted in the ACS. Now that 10.9 is, there's not much variation around that. And if someone made an estimate much larger than that, then it would be up to them to justify their estimate of undercount. We add 1.3 million for undercount in 2023. Our usual undercount runs about 6 or 7% per year. And in 2023, we added 500,000 extra undercount, and that's all explained in the report, and I won't take the time to go into that detail. But we had about 500,000 extra undercount in 2023, mostly because of the difficulty of enumerating people in those shelters and other places. So this gets us to a total of 12.2 million estimated number in 2023. The next slide shows the trends in the population all the way from 1990 to 2023. You know, when I was preparing this, I realized that I have a published estimate of the undocumented population for every single year shown here, which means, man, I've been doing this for a long, long time. Anyway, you see the numbers increased from 1990 to 2008 pretty steadily. After that, they dropped for about 12 years, down to 10.1 million, and then they jumped. And I want to go out of my out of character here. I try to work with data, but I'm going to project for the next couple of years. My sense is that we're pretty close to a peak. The numbers will peak at about 13.5 or 14 million in 2023 or so, and then they'll decline even more rapidly than they have been. But I should stop doing that because I'm not sure there's a lot of interest in that right now. But the next slide that I have gets into a little bit more detail about what happened in 2021 and 22 and 23. I think I love this graph. I think it's interesting. You see all the way from 2013 to 2020, mostly the population declined. And the bars being below, or the blue bars being below the line show that more people left the population than came here. So if you think, for example, that 800,000 came, then that means about 900,000 left the population. So that goes along from 2013 right up to 2021, and all of a sudden, obviously, the numbers jump. And the 890 and the 1065 numbers are our estimates of how much the population grew in those years. Now, I went to the report that Philip Connor did published in IMR, and I figured out approximately the change in the population that are asylum applicants and the number that were parolees. So essentially, I drew that little white line, which I'm kind of proud of. The numbers below the white line are how much the asylum applicants and parolees increased in those years. The entire blue line is how much our population estimates increased. So if you were to eliminate the numbers below the white lines, then then everything would look pretty normal. I mean, the population would have increased by a couple of 100,000. It would have been right in line with everything else. So it shows the impact of the asylum applicants and the parolees. And I don't really have any more to explain with this, but I just thought it was an interesting graph that kind of highlights the importance of these asylum applicants and parolees. I'm going to take about 2 more minutes or 2 or 3 more minutes to we can move on to the next slide. And these are kind of small, I know, and I hope you can see them okay. We have 4 pages of graphs in the report, and I'm only going to cover 2 of them. And what we see here is the total population, as we see, has been declining until 2020, and then it jumped to 12.2. Population from Mexico has declined for 10 or 12 years, at least until 2020. It went up some, but not a whole lot. And the numbers for Central America are particularly interesting to me because they started to increase more rapidly in 2019. So essentially what happened was we saw all the caravans coming through and big increases in 2019. And that just continued right on to 2023 for the Central American countries. You see that same kind of rapid increase for Guatemala and Honduras. So that's kind of what we already thought, and it's not very surprising. But the last graph that I have to show you next is the most fascinating set of data that I've been doing this for a long time. To me, this is really amazing information. Look at the numbers for South America, for example. The numbers increased by 60,000 in the first 8 years of this decade. And then they increased by 785,000. I've just never seen anything like that in the data. I've been following this since 2010. It's just an amazing jump in the data. And you see that the same thing happened for all these 5 countries that I'm showing make up about 90% of the undocumented population in South America. And you see that, for example, the population in Ecuador was declining throughout the whole decade. And I don't have time to go into the specifics of what happened, but bad things happened in Ecuador in 2018, 19, and so on. And it shows not only how well the ACS picks up events that happen around the world, but it also shows how our estimation procedure is precise enough to pick that out from the ACS. And I'll just finish with Venezuela. It was only 55,000 and it grew to 445, which is amazing growth. And well, I urge you to look at the report, look over the graphs, and if you have questions, get in touch. And I think with that, I'll just turn things over to Phil.
Thanks, Bob. Let me just grab my slides here and we'll get started. I trust people can see the slides. Great, thank you. So again, my name is Philip Connor. I am Senior Demographer at Forward.us. Forward.us is a bipartisan advocacy organization that advocates for pro-immigrant policies that move our country forward. And I'm really grateful to have been invited to be part of this panel at the Center for Migration Studies. I'm aiming today to highlight something that I think many that are that work with immigrants or that advocate for them or policymakers may not quite realize the extent by which the undocumented population, many are actually documented, have some kind of level of authorization, have some kind of level of temporary protections. And this is something that has grown over the years, and I want to kind of give some data behind it to show that. As mentioned earlier, I published the general aim of this talk today in the International Migration Review and their 60th anniversary special issue. So if you do want to find more details on methodology and context and other aspects that I'm unable to share here because of time restraints, I encourage you to go look at that article. If you just Google IMR and 60th anniversary, you'll come across it. And thankfully to the editors of that journal, of which, along with the Center for Migration Studies, they've opened up the access for that just this morning. And so you can access that article today. So in this article, Protected Yet Undocumented, I provide the data for the case that there has been this growth of like liminal status. There's many different terms have been used, quasi-legal, authorized, documented, and so forth. And the results I share today, however, are basically an update of data from this article. This article reflects estimates more for 2023. In our shop here at forward.us, we actually project the population through to 2024 to have a little bit more real-time policy making. And so today's are the most recent data that I can provide you today. And also trying to highlight something that was made kind of more known in the New York Times in January of 2025 when we shared some data with them, to be able to show that basically about 40%, according to our estimates of the undocumented population, have some level of temporary permission to be in the United States. That means that they are not eligible for deportation. That means also many of them have access to work permits. You can see the kind of rough edges of these bubbles here, demonstrating the fact that these are estimates. It's kind of difficult sometimes to be able to assess precisely, but basically it's about 40% temporary permission and 60% with no legal status at all. And so who are these groups that are making up this temporarily protected population? Let me just roll through the largest ones, and I won't take too much time here. Temporary protected status. These are for folks that can't return to their country safely. And so basically the administration, or perhaps the Congress, assigns an 18-month or longer duration. This can be renewable, and for some countries it's been renewed for many years, but newer ones most recently. Most have probably heard about the deferred action for childhood arrivals, started by President Obama in 2012. Those that are dreamers, came into the country as children, could meet specific eligibility requirements and could apply for that program. And then we have those that have adjustment to non-immigrant status. Increasingly, there's been a greater backlog in those that are applying for U and T visas. These are people that are victims or witnesses of criminal activities, labor violations, and trafficking. And because of the backlog, it's increased the number of people that are deferred for deportation while they wait for the processing of their application, or wait for the T or U visa after they are approved, or even of those that actually get the T or U visa to actually wait in the backlog to get their green card. And so this population has grown over time. We also have the special immigrant juvenile status. These are youth that arrived into the country under the protection of the state due to neglect or abuse. Same situation as the T and U visa. We have a growing backlog of which many years people will be waiting to be able to receive that level of a green card coming out of their application. And so while they're waiting their application, they are deferred from deportation. And some have access to work permits. As already mentioned, the growth in asylum seekers is quite large in the past recent years, both in affirmative and defensive in terms of the application queue. Many wait for years and years before they have their asylum application heard or processed. And then recently we've had humanitarian parole for Afghanistan, Ukraine, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, as well as those that entered during the last 2 years of the Biden administration under CBP-1 app at the US southern border. And so these are the largest groups. There are others, but these are the ones that kind of most prominently feature into the growth of the temporarily protected population. And so you can see this growth coming from 2012, where there was basically less than 1 million that had any levels of protection, as I've described here before, growing to about 5.6 plus million as of the end of 2024. Now, just let me kind of give a description here of what kind of groups have grown over time. DACA, for example, grew during the mid-teens, 2015, 16, 17, 17, 18, but then has subsequently declined or decreased as a share, as a group of that population, as some have, for various reasons, not been part of that population going forward. TPS holders have grown recently by a large amount, so much so that there are around 1.1, 1.2 million TPS holders in the country right now, more than half from Haiti or Venezuela. We've seen the growth of that backlog in the special immigrant juvenile status in just recent years, as well as a very sudden recent experience with the growing number of people with under parole into the country, under humanitarian parole. And of course, the growth of asylum applications has increased year by year. If you add up all those numbers to the panel on the left, you'll actually come to a number that's 7 million or so. So why am I saying 5.6 million? Great question. I'm glad you asked. Is because these temporarily protected individuals have multiple protections, many of them. So you can imagine situations in which someone enters the country under parole, but then later applies for asylum. You can also mention someone that enters the country, applies for asylum, and decides that maybe TPS would be a stronger and more durable type of process for them, and so they apply for TPS. There's probably very few cases where people have more than two protections. underway, but many have too. And so here are just some estimates based on the American Community Survey data that we operate with, similar to what Bob had discussed earlier, where we actually select based on certain characteristics these different protected groups within the American Community Survey. So these are not administrative figures. I want to be very clear. I did not obtain these from USCIS or DHS. These are estimates based on the data that we have on hand to be able to get the best sense of how this may work out. And more details on this methodology can be found in the article I mentioned earlier. So roughly 37% of SIJS applicants could have an asylum claim right now undergoing. 40% of parolees could have an asylum claim. 25% of parolees could have TPS. 27% of TPS could have an asylum claim, and 15% of UT visa applicants that are in the backlog could also have an asylum claim. And so we can see these kind of overlapping circles develop, and that is why the total does not expressly, you can't just add these group up because there are overlaps between. I kind of leave DACA to the side because we assume that basically very few DACA recipients likely are applying for any of these other protections. And so by actually putting these statuses within the American Community Survey, I'm able to actually retain some level of characteristics for these populations. And so I just want to kind of briefly highlight just a few numbers here on some demographics and other characteristics. So you can see the special juvenile status, for example, in terms of age, are younger. Makes sense. They're juveniles and arrived in that way. Also, those that have been paroled are relatively young compared to the other groups that are listed there, like DACA recipients who have lived here in the United States for a long time, as well as those without any legal status. And as you would imagine, that those that have been paroled or asylum seekers, the average number of years in the US is pretty short, whereas DACA recipients, for example, have been in the United States for, on average, a very long time. And then in terms of origins, we can see that basically TPS holders come from a range of countries, but primarily from Latin America. DACA recipients, almost overwhelmingly, the majority is from Mexico, but other places as well. Special immigrant juvenile status, Central America, Mexico, UNT visas, majority likely Mexico, and then some from other Central American countries. Those that have been paroled into the United States, we can see several from Latin America, but also keep in mind that Ukraine has received a lot of parolees as well into this country, and so that's why that Europe is at 16%. Asylum seekers from a range of countries, but largely south of the border, and then those without legal status, about half, without any legal status whatsoever, are from Mexico, according to our estimates. And then if we look at education, I just want to focus in on the some college row here. We can see, interestingly enough, that DACA recipients, nearly half, 42%, have some amount of college. Doesn't mean they've completed it necessarily, but they have some amount of college, which is somewhat interesting, the same as similar on a score to TPS holders, as well as those that have been paroled. So more recent arrivals through TPS holders and parolees seem to have a fairly high level of education relative to those, for example, without legal status. And those people obviously mostly obtain that level of education abroad, whereas DACA recipients obtain their education within the United States. And then parents and spouses of US citizens allow us to assess of how integrated these groups are within the communities. So DACA recipients, about half of them are either parents or spouses of US citizens. Similarly to also with those without legal status, it's pretty high with that group as well, largely because they've lived in the United States for a long time. And labor force participation can vary across groups, but just keep in mind that those that are most recently arrived, like those that have been paroled or asylum seekers, are less likely to be in the labor force, just largely because it takes a little bit of time to be able to actually, get their job, be able to have the work permit and so forth, to be able to get into the workforce. And then finally, I do have some estimates on likely industries of employment. Keep in mind that if those have a work permit, like those with TPS holders and DACA recipients, UT visa backlogs and parolees, and some degree asylum seekers, they can more generally have a greater access to the labor market compared to those without legal status, right? So when we think of those without legal status, they largely work in the informal economy, perhaps in construction and agriculture, maybe a few other industries, leisure and hospitality. But those that may have a work permit, like DACA recipients, and to a degree even those that are paroled or TPS holders, are perhaps more likely to be in industries like information and finance, health, and education, where those work permits are very valuable and allow them to access a greater access to the broader labor market. With that, I'll stop there and I'll pass it over to Ryan.
Thank you, Philip. And I want to also start by thanking CMS for what has emerged as a great intellectual partnership and what I'm really pleased to be a part of. Let me share my slides and get started. Great. So what I want to do today, what my goal is to complement the discussion we've had so far. I mean, Bob has very expertly laid out the estimates that we've just come up with for 2023. Philip has brought in some new information about those with liminal status and how we should think about those within our estimates. My goal is to talk about the larger context in which we find these populations. And so I don't know about you, but if you study immigration, last week seems like a long time ago. 2023 seems like a very long time ago. So I want to refresh our memories about some of the trends that were underway then as it pertains to policy. I also want to, I'll end my portion of this talk, talking about policy changes that have happened since 2023, and in particular with the arrival of the new administration. First up is Title 42. Familiar, I'm sure, to many, but I want to refresh our memories about this particular policy that was in place through much of 2023. It actually dates back to the mid-1940s through the Public Health Act. It gives the president power to severely limit the arrival and acceptance of immigrants into the United States, ostensibly to stop the spread of disease. What we know is that this policy was put in place by Donald Trump at the end of his presidency and continued through much of the Biden administration, ending in May 2023. So to put some numbers to this, and I want to thank our friends at Migration Policy Institute who put together this really nice table. You can see the kinds of border encounters and noted the start of Title 42 and the end of Title 42. Again, this was a widespread power that the president had to disallow the acceptance of immigrants coming into the United States. What's notable here is that ultimately this about 2.8 million people is the estimate that MPIs come up with were stopped from coming across the Mexican-U.S. border. It's notable that this policy didn't have the same kinds of consequences for those who attempted to come across. That is, they were not, if they were tried to cross multiple times, they were not penalized in some way. It is also important to point out that this typically did not allow asylum requests or severely constrained asylum requests during this period. Of course, after Title 42 is revoked, Title 8 is the other policy that was in place, and that governed how we operated at the border. Title 8 does allow asylum requests. It does have penalties for people, multiple attempts to cross. And so one of the things we're seeing halfway through the year in 2023 was a substantial increase in numbers of people coming across and claiming asylum. You've heard Bob and Philip both talk about this, but I wanted to talk about some of the policies that are in place to help us understand it. Second thing, TPS, also something that Philip in particular has talked about. When we think about TPS and its expansion under the Biden administration, as Philip noted, about 1.2 million people as of, by my estimates, March 2024, as either being eligible for TPS or actually receiving TPS. Most notably for us, in thinking about the 2023 estimates, Venezuela and immigrants from Venezuela is playing a really prominent role here. Around 470,000 Venezuelan immigrants eligible to receive TPS, and so that's quite notable. The other thing that's notable about TPS is that TPS recipients and those, well, in this case, recipients, live across the United States in every state. This map compliments of Jill Wilson from the Congressional Research Service. And you can see that while there are TPS immigrants living across the United States, they're really concentrated in about half dozen states, most notably Florida, Texas, and California. Not surprising for those who study immigration, and in particular, thinking about the rise in Venezuelans and others from Latin America helps explain some of the concentrations that we're seeing on this map. The other issue that I want to address here, again, to remind us of what was underway in 2023, was the arrival of the CPB-1 app and how it proved to be pivotal for how many people were entering the United States. So in particular, this app was present before, but the Biden administration introduced it as a way for folks who are interested in applying for asylum to register, create an appointment, and get into a queue to have an appointment for an asylum claim. What we see is this, while this began in earnest in January 2023, we could see those who had credible fear claims and asylum applicants using it, and that increased dramatically. I also want to point out that in addition to those who are interested in claiming asylum at a port of entry, the so-called CHNV parolees, that is parolees from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, were required to use this app to register information about themselves and their families. So this is also notable. As I'll discuss a little bit more in just a moment, the CBP-1 app was initially canceled by the Trump administration. All of those appointments canceled, but recently has come back and has come back with a very different goal. And again, I'll address that in just a moment. I do want to show you some of the data around those that are applying for asylum. So this chart coming out of Homeland Security statistics shows those that are affirmatively applying for asylum by fiscal year. I want to point out that this ramps up in 2022. You see it double by 2023. As Philip noted, it takes years to have an asylum claim adjudicated by an immigration court. And so the aggregate of people who have applied and are waiting is adding up here, right? And so these are applications filed, but we know these folks are living with liminal status in the United States, waiting for their adjudication, in many cases eligible to apply for work permits after some period of time in the US. One of the things that has manifested with asylum seekers is the increase in sheltered homelessness. So HUD every year does a count of those that are without shelter and those that are unsheltered homeless, as well as unsheltered homeless. And it's quickly become apparent that asylum-seeking migrants in particular were helping to drive some of the increase in the homeless numbers that we were seeing starting in 2022, but all the way to 2023 and 2024 as well. This is a picture of the Roosevelt Hotel in Manhattan, which became kind of emblematic of as it was converted to a shelter for those without housing, and many migrants going through this particular shelter. This created, as I think many of us are aware, a substantial amount of strain. And it raises the question of, how big of a deal was this? There's a recent working paper by Meyer, Weiss, and Williams, published by NBER, and they're estimating that between 2022 and 2024, a large increase in the homeless population occurred, and about 60% of that, according to their estimates, was because of asylum-seeking migrants. I want to stress, because it would be very easy to imagine people misusing these data to vilify the migrants themselves. Without access to work permit, as people are going through a lawful process of having an asylum claim adjudicated, this is within their rights to be in the United States, and this is a resource that is made available. And so that's an important thing to understand. In addition to New York City, Chicago, Denver, Boston, and more generally Massachusetts are also areas where this is happening, but it's not limited to that. So my own work here in Minneapolis, our shelter system increased substantially the numbers of folks living there in the past several years. About a third of them are asylum seekers from Latin America, specifically from Ecuador. And you can see some of the numbers here on this slide with some headlines that came from the local newspaper here. The last thing I want to pivot to talking about recent policy actions that we've seen, and then we'll conclude and turn it over for Q&A. Many of us are, I think, aware of these, but it's worth underscoring. A lot of the action that the Trump administration has pursued as it pertains to immigration has been with the goal of increasing the pool of people who are at risk of removal. That's my assessment in looking at the policies and some of the data. So, for example, recent moves to terminate substantial portions of TPS recipients and parole. This has recently been upheld by the Supreme Court as a justifiable action on the part of the Trump administration. This is notable, right? And so people who had this liminal secure status now or very soon will not, and are left in quite a bind. As I mentioned before, the CBP-1 app, originally canceled by the Trump administration, came back this time with a notice to those that had registered that they were no longer eligible to be in the United States. Many advocates saw this as a way of pushing a self-deportation goal, and this was, of course, met with a lot of confusion because, as Philip has pointed out, those that were waiting for adjudications or had used it for parole status oftentimes had other statuses that were giving them some kind of protection. Right, to receive a message that you are no longer eligible to be in the United States when you're waiting on a different kind of claim was met with a great deal of confusion. It's notable that denials on asylum claims have ramped up considerably in the past many months, such that around 80% have been denied as of April 2025. This was closer to 50 or 60% during the Biden administration. Some of the most public kind of displays of enforcement have been on an increase of expedited removal on the part of the Trump administration. Now, historically, this has occurred around the border. The Trump administration has loosened this to occur anywhere in the United States for those that can't demonstrate that they've been in the United States for at least 2 years. The use of the Alien Enemies Act, currently being litigated, but currently stayed, is a part of this. Finally, since I'm at a university, and perhaps many people who participate in this are, we are also seeing the removal of people with lawful permanent resident status, and we're seeing the cancellation of student visas. And this is at universities, but also a much wider issue. Last thing I want to talk about are potential congressional actions and how we ought to think about that. So in the news recently is the Trump administration's so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The Senate will now be taking this bill up. It was passed by the House. And I want to point out 3 provisions in this bill that I think are particularly notable when thinking about immigration in general and the undocumented population specifically. So the first provision that's notable is a $60 billion supplemental funding increase over 4 years to the Customs and Border Protection. This is 4 times the current annual budget for CBP, and a lot of this is going to be ramped into protections on the border, including barriers. Second, a $75 billion supplemental funding increase for ICE over 4 years. Most of this geared towards detention. This is about an 800% increase in the current annual budgets. And then finally, something that you could easily miss are new application fees that have been announced as a part of this budget. A $1,000 application fee for asylum seekers, for those who have been granted asylum or are waiting for their asylum adjudication, I should say, a $550 fee for a work permit that they have to renew every 6 months with a new $550 fee. So this is a massive expansion in the kinds of really prohibitive kinds of fees that many migrants are going to experience. We all eyes now in the Senate to see how this particular bill will be modified. With that, let me conclude, turn it back over to Mario, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Bob, Philip, and Ryan. Superb and incredibly interesting and provocative. And I think setting the stage in a sense for a lot of discussions that happen over time. We have a good number of questions, so I'll sort of jump right in, and I'll do my best to kind of synthesize some of them and maybe find a bit of a common theme to them. We have two questions from Celia Toro and then Sister Rose that I think bring two ideas together. So I'll sort of share these, and I think maybe these, Bob and Philip, these maybe are directed more towards you. Why don't we more systematically speak about immigrants on the one hand and on the other asylum seekers? And I take it the question kind of says, look, there's a sense in which the asylum seekers have a slightly different process or different levels of protection. So is there a reason why kind of from a categorizing perspective, they're sort of lumped all as one? And to that point, I think Sister Rose asks, then in the world of protected temporary statuses, are these really protections, Philip? And I know you can't really answer the philosophical question, but she asked, right, if in a sense those protections can be simply taken away, what is the consequence and meaning of those in time? You want to take a shot at those, Bob and Philip?
Philip, go ahead.
Okay, I will, sure. Thanks for those questions. So starting with the last one, with the protections aspect here. So we have seen temporary protected status be removed or be terminated in the next couple months ahead for one of the Venezuela designations, Nepal, Cameroon. We could anticipate there could be others, we don't know. We also know there's revocation of the CHMV parole, which is more than 500,000 people. So these kind of removals of protections are occurring. At the same time, as I mentioned before, the overlaps, as we estimate, with those that have applied for asylum, which would represent some in these groups, would allow for those protections to continue under law. And so protection from deportation, also perhaps as a work permit, depending on how they actually access that initial work permit that they are currently working under. So these protections are not all completely gone for some. So there is still a level of protection that can exist, largely as asylum as a backstop for so many. On the first part of the question, conventionally, and Bob can fill in some here, conventionally, demographers have included asylum seekers as part of the undocumented population estimate. This has been largely because we use different methods, but those that might use like a residual method or so forth, it's everyone that's not a citizen, that's not an LP, that's not have a green card holder, that's not a non-immigrant. And so everyone else is undocumented in some way, is how it's been determined in the past. The challenge, of course, is in the past, there wasn't as many protected population groups. Even the number of asylum seekers back in the 2010s was not that many. And so we're in a new reality now, in trying to understand how we unpackage and how we actually describe these populations. You've heard a lot of different uses of different terms. I think we're all trying to grapple with the current situation. As 40%, as I mentioned, as many as 40% have some kind of level of temporary protections. That's a much larger share when it was far below 10% a decade ago. And so demography is catching up in some ways, maybe, to this new reality that's happened in just the past few years in major ways. Bob, maybe you can fill in some context there. I'm not sure.
I think excellent summary there, Philip. But I would say that we've always all the demographers have always been aware that we have 500,000 to maybe 2 million people that we call undocumented that really would not be removable from the country if they encountered I started to say INS, but that sort of dates me a little bit, doesn't it? We've known this, but the problem, as you alluded to, is it's very difficult to remove them because they're hard to identify. For example, people who have DACA, for example, we can pretty much identify those. We could take those out, but then we're taking out part of them and not putting in others. So we end up. I haven't really talked to other demographers, but my guess is that they feel like we can't remove those groups because then we'll be giving low population estimates, and the politicians who basically know better will say, no, they're too low, they're no good. So it's a really tricky business in terms of, in the first place, it's hard to identify them. In the second place, you kind of want to say, this is what probably the most number. This is probably the largest number. And so we go with the largest number. It's very confusing.
Thank you. Ryan, a couple questions that relate to, I guess, maybe labor and based on your presentation, if I can. These are from George Lemaitre, and I'll read you both of them. You can take them sort of as you wish. But he says the numbers we see here in your presentation refer to resident status. How about employment status? 2025 report in the New York Times cited the Social Security Administration saying that 3/4 of unauthorized immigrants were declared by their employers as paying payroll and income taxes. And then with the advent of E-Verify, that percentage seems to have gone down to 45. Do you have a sense of what that situation is now? The second question, again, speculative to an extent, but I think it opens up the problem, is the number of unauthorized immigrants currently employed is estimated to be around 8 million. And from what I understand, it's about 5% of the workforce. It's likely, says George, that the deportations of 8 million will be carried out. And given that, what will, in a sense, be the effect on the U.S. labor market and economy?
Thanks for the questions, George. So this will admittedly be speculative, as Mario indicated. Let me take the last one first. I think that, well, first of all, I think a lot remains to be seen about how successful this administration will be in pursuing what were some astronomical numbers that they talked about in terms of their intentions on removal. Removal is incredibly expensive, provided that you follow through with due process, and that's a critical caveat. If due process goes out the window, it seems to me that removal becomes much cheaper and easier to do. That's just stating the obvious. But if you are going to abide by due process, it's hard to see, and I know, Bob, you have some opinions about this as well, it's hard to see how absent really tremendous kinds of resources that would have to be increased, much more, I would imagine, than we're even contemplating in this bill. It just doesn't seem reasonable that they're going to get to the millions and millions of people that they've said they want to. Now, I've been wrong before, but that's kind of the premise I begin with. But to come back to the basis of your question, I think any kind of removal is in our current labor market is tough. And the reason I say that in particular, so I've mentioned I work with Minnesota Extension. There are many in the ag community that rely on labor from immigrants, and in particular undocumented immigrants. Our housing market and the construction industry relies on undocumented immigrants. And when those populations go away, things become more expensive. Milk's not delivered. Crops aren't picked. Housing doesn't get constructed, right? And so it would have a reverberating effect. Even marginal changes in that workforce, I think, will have a reverberating effect. So that's my response. I've taken up enough time, probably. So maybe we should move to a new set of questions. But Bob, if you have any insights on the deportation and the difficulty of removal.
No, I actually couldn't add anything to that. I've been very skeptical, and the statements I've made privately always, the statements are that exactly as you say, if due process holds up, there's just no way that that you could identify 8, 9, 10 million people. They're just living out in the neighborhoods with everybody else. It can't be done. But I've been astonished many times, and I don't want to make any firm statements. I just, like I say, as you said, if due process holds up, um, they probably not a whole lot more will be removed than has been true of other administrations.
Sort of follow up or follow through a couple of questions that I think go to maybe Bob, and Ryan, your future reports to come, and Philip, a little bit of how you run some of your calculations. But a thought, two questions that seem related is: do you have a sense of what will be or how to count the numbers of self-deportations under the current administrations, and what those will look like or how you'll get to them? And a particular question about if any of you can speculate on what is the effect or what might be seen as the numerical effect of the 3 and 10-year bar on the undocumented. In other words, IRA's provisions that, in a sense, put people in a frozen state, right? They couldn't leave, but they couldn't adjust. So they became trapped in this sort of undocumented limbo. And the question is, do you have a sense of what that number might be?
I'll take a little shot at that. I'm not sure about this number that I'm going to quote here, but my sense is that maybe 500,000, 5 or 600,000 people would be affected by the 3 and 10-year bar. Keep in mind that if an immigrant, if a migrant came here from anywhere, including Mexico, by air and overstayed their visa, they can adjust. They can marry a U.S. citizen or whatever, and they can adjust. The 3 and 10-year bar mostly affects people from Mexico and Central America. But I'm not sure what the numbers are. In fact, I think, didn't the administration propose something? I'm okay. I'm off track here, but I think I'll just leave it at that. I just remember that if people are overstays, which in the last 15 years during the last decade, 2 out of 3 new arrivals, undocumented arrivals, arrived by air. So I guess the point I'm making is that most immigrants are not affected by the 3 and 10-year bar.
If I can jump in here, Mario, for just a second. So we do estimate there's about 1.1, 1.2 million undocumented immigrants married to U.S. citizen spouses. A large number of those, several 100,000, as Bob mentioned, have entered the United States and overstayed a visa. And so there would be potentially a process by which that they could legalize their status. However, I think Bob's pretty close. It's probably 500, 700,000, somewhere there, those that cross without inspection that are living under that 3 and 10-year bar, just by the nature of spousal relationship. There are other ways by which you meet 3 and 10-year bar. Maybe you have an adult child that would like to sponsor you and so forth. And so this is an area that, that there is much legislation been proposed to be able to deal with this situation.
Thank you. We really have time for one more question, and there are many more out there. By the way, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted as well as shared. So for those of you who have asked that question, so there's a lot of questions in the Q&A we can't answer, but I want to end on one that I think is both challenging and I think in some sense is hopeful, and I think brings us forward to sort of what do you do with this data? So be prepared. Yervang asks, very appreciative, she says, of these helpful statistics and data, but it's the experience of the questioner that when we present facts and data to better inform and educate, skeptics don't pay attention and don't necessarily care. So to the extent that you do this and you bring your own science, but then kind of creative imagination, what do you do and what do you suggest? And what do you suggest to the group as ways to package the data and statistics to message and better educate immigration skeptics? And if you can answer those in 20 seconds each, you'll get
You're a
great
genius.
reward. Anybody can go first.
I'll jump in if I just.
Great.
So I think there are two aspects that at Ford we emphasize really importantly on these data. One is that the majority of undocumented immigrants, whether they have no legal status at all or they have some kind of temporary status, are connected through family within the United States. U.S. citizen children, U.S. citizen spouses, U.S. citizen relatives, and more broadly, U.S. citizens within their communities that they interact with daily. I think that kind of integrative connection is very key in terms of sharing the fact that, millions of undocumented immigrants live with U.S. citizens, and even more is a greater number than the number of undocumented immigrants themselves. So that's one aspect. The other one, of course, is the labor force. As already mentioned, large percentages, above 10%, I can't say the exact number right offhand, but those are construction workers, and like 50% of farm workers are undocumented immigrants or have some level of temporary protections. And so the result to the economy is the other one that I think people need to always keep in mind as we look at this population and messaging into those, as you said, skeptics.
The thing I would add to what Philip has mentioned is that I think that the data are helpful, but insufficient for talking about this issue. And so what I do when I do public presentations is I pair data like this with stories about that humanize these immigrants who are living in our communities. I think you have to come to the conclusion you're not going to convince every skeptic out there. But I find that a more powerful combination than relying just on statistics or just on storytelling alone. I think combining them is really critical.
Bob, you want the last word?
I would just say that I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, so I think it's really valuable, and I've been really frustrated that that policymakers, or especially politicians, don't seem to confer about our data. But I also think that there is a value in making these estimates because it keeps some level of reality, because most people, if they're really serious about this, they'll come to our numbers and they'll ask about the numbers. And even back in ancient times, when IRCA was being considered in 1987, I was the head of statistics at INS. We projected accurately how many people would come forward and apply. And so they have value whether or not you can always see it or not. What you see is loud people talking, but in the background, I think these things are still valuable.
Thank you. And I think that expresses profoundly the eloquence of these numbers, of these statistics, and their humanizing context and thrust. So very much appreciated, Bob, Philip, and Ryan. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your work. Looking forward to continuing to work together and keeping moving forward. So thank you, and thank you for all of those of you who participated and attended today. We'll see you next time. Thank you.